It probably comes as no surprise that exercise is critical for our health. There's a strong link between cardiorespiratory fitness or aerobic fitness and cardiovascular disease, cancer, as well as something called all-cause mortality, which is just death from any cause. So how does exercise impact our brain, and what are the best types of exercise to improve our cognitive health? In the 1970s, researchers noticed an interesting correlation between people who played sports and people who didn't. The people that played sports actually had better brain function. And it was the first time that people thought about this idea that physical exercise could actually help the brain. Up until that point, people thought that studying and reading and cognitive things help the brain, but this was the first time that physical activity could boost brain function. So over the last 50 years, that's been explored extensively, and we now know there's definitely a link between our physical activity and our brain health. But what is the best exercise for the brain? Well, that question is actually too simplistic because there are numerous types of exercise. What is the right duration? What is the right intensity? And when we say brain, what are we talking about? Are we talking about memory? Are we talking about executive function? Are we talking about processing speed? So what I hope to do in this video is just give you a background on how we like to view exercise in the brain and give you some practical takeaways to be able to implement. The first thing to talk about with exercise and brain health comes from really kind of a landmark study that was published in The Lancet in 2014. That study showed that there were 7 markers or 7 factors that could prevent 33% of cases of Alzheimer's dementia. One of those 7 was physical inactivity. And more research has come out supporting that. So the first big takeaway is that the data behind exercise and cognitive decline is the strongest for prevention. So if you're not exercising now, you need to start, because that's where you get the most bang for your buck. Prevention is the best medicine. So starting to exercise now is really critical. It can still help once you have dementia or Alzheimer's. It can still be helpful. We encourage all of our patients to exercise, but it's especially important for prevention. What are the best types of exercise for the brain? Well, spoiler alert, each type of exercise has pros and cons, but the 4 main ones that we want to focus on today are steady state cardio, high intensity interval training, resistance training or weightlifting, and a 4th one that most people don't think of, which is kind of called mind-body exercise. So what is steady state cardio, or what some people also call zone 2 cardio? Well, what it means is steady state is your heart rate is going to be the same throughout the workout, and zone 2 is referring to the intensity. So it's kind of a moderate intensity. It's kind of like a 4 or 5 out of 10. So what that looks like is walking on a treadmill at an incline, or maybe cycling. This is also where people talk about the talk test, which means you could have a conversation with someone while you're exercising, but the conversation would be a little bit breathy. So that specific type of exercise is really good for your mitochondria. And the brain is full of mitochondria because it uses a lot of energy. It uses about 20% of the body's energy, even though the brain only makes up about 2% of the body's volume. Increasing mitochondria is really important. The other thing is this specific type of exercise might, and the research isn't conclusive, but it might be better specifically for memory than a higher intensity or a lower intensity type of exercise. The next type of exercise is something called high intensity interval training, also known as HIIT. So Almost everyone has heard of this at this point. There's gyms popping up everywhere. It's kind of the rage. Everyone's doing high intensity, and really for good reason. You can get a big workout done in a short amount of time. You can achieve really good results, and there may be some benefits to this specific intensity of training. One of those may be something called a decrease in senescent cells. So what in the world does that mean? Well, senescent cells you can kind of think of like zombie cells. They are in this transition where they're not dead, but they're also not alive and doing what your body wants them to do. So they're just kind of taking up space and causing problems. And when we're younger, the body's pretty good at kind of killing off these zombie cells and replacing it with new cells. But as we age, those zombie cells start to grow in number, and it's actually one of the 9 hallmarks of aging. So this type of high intensity training might be helpful for reducing those type of senescent cells, which can also be beneficial for the brain. So far, we've talked about moderate intensity, steady state cardio. We've talked about high intensity interval training, which can be cardio or can kind of be combined with some resistance exercise. And that's really the third type we want to talk about, which is resistance exercise or strength training. Now, most people think of this as you got to go to the gym and lift dumbbells and this whole thing. And it doesn't have to be that. It can be if that's what you like. It can also be bands, it can be body weight exercises, certain types of yoga, anything that is strengthening the muscles of the body. So how do the muscles of the body relate to the brain? It's actually a fascinating area of research, and there's a clear correlation. It's not proven to be causative yet, but there definitely is a correlation between low muscle mass, something called sarcopenia, and a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. Studies published over the last couple years have been really surprisingly consistent on the benefits of this strength training for the brain. And what has really come out of that is a clear improvement in something called executive function. Executive function is this fancy word that a lot of people use, and it's kind of hard to nail it down, but it's basically if you wanted to go plan to go out bowling with your friends and then actually follow through the steps with how you would actually do that and make that happen, that's executive function. So that's the area that resistance training is especially helpful for. The last type of exercise is called mind-body, and that's not as common in our Western culture. That includes stuff like Tai Chi or even learning a new dance, like learning to dance salsa lessons. So these type of mind-body movements, they challenge the brain in a way that is different than just like running on a treadmill, because you're having to learn the steps, you're having to stay on beat, you're having to, even interact with another person while you're exercising. So it just challenges the brain in a different way. And this type of movement or exercise seems to be especially helpful for people that have already been diagnosed with some sort of dementia. What have we learned today? Well, the first thing we talked about was that prevention is key. So starting to exercise now to prevent cognitive decline and to maintain healthy cognitive performance throughout aging, you're gonna get a lot more bang for your buck than waiting to start once you've already had decline. Second thing we talked about was the 4 different types of exercise, and really what we counsel people to do is to do a little bit of all of them. Do some steady state cardio, do some high intensity, do some strength training, and even incorporate some mind body. But there's one thing that we haven't talked about that is critical. The benefits of exercise are only seen when you actually do it. And that seems obvious, but for a lot of people, when they get into an exercise routine, they want to do this ideal thing and they don't really like it, so they don't stick to it long term. So that's the last point, is find activities that you genuinely enjoy so that you stick to it long term. Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. Hope you like the content we're putting out here. If you're enjoying it, hit that subscribe button to stay updated for all of our future videos.